With me tonight, Nicola Sturgeon, Deputy First Minister of Scotland, Wendy Alexander, leader of the Scottish Labour Party, David Steele, former leader of the Liberal Party, later presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament, now a Liberal Democratic peer, Annabel Goldie, leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, and the writer and broadcaster, David Aaronovitch. Well, thank you very much indeed. Good evening from Glasgow. Just before we start, the usual message that you can have your say about what we say by texting us during the programme, and it'll be debated, everything you have to say, on Question Time Extra on News 24 immediately after this programme. So you can text us, you can email us, send your reaction to us. 83981 is the number to text us on. CFAX page 155 will tell you what other people are saying. And you can email us at our website at the usual address. Let's have our first question tonight, which comes from Kevin Kelly, please. Kevin Kelly.
Is the HMRC blunder the final nail in the coffin of ID cards?
The revenue and tax and customs blunder, is it the final nail in the coffin of ID cards? Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, my view, quite clearly, it certainly should be the final nail in the coffin of ID cards. I've never been able to see the sense or the logic in spending, some say £10 billion on ID cards when nobody is very clear at all on what the benefit or the purpose of them are. Now, after the chaos of this week, what we have is the population much more suspicious about the storing of personal information on large databases. Now, clearly there are some circumstances where that's a good thing and there are benefits attached to it. But in the case of ID cards, that's not the case. And I think Gordon Brown and the government should now come out and say that ID cards will not go ahead.
Simply because of that? Because
no, I've always been opposed to ID cards.
No, but you say when they should now say, well, OK, game's up, it didn't work. We must
well, I think they should probably admit that they've never made the case for ID cards. They've never managed to persuade the majority of people in this country that there's any case for ID cards. But, if they weren't of that view before the events of this week, I think they should now pause and take the view that if there ever was an argument for them, that argument is now gone.
Okay. Wendy Alexander.
Well, I think the first thing to say is what happened this week was an appalling breach and clearly has shaken confidence of everybody. I think what it throws into stark relief is we need to find a way to worry about our identities being stolen. And that's why, certainly in terms of passports, we're going down the route of saying we need to have our fingerprints because that's a way in which you know who people are. And I don't think we are going to go back to the era before computers. I don't think we are going to go back to filing cabinets. And one of the challenges is, how do we let all of us prove who we are? It's crazy to go into a bank and if you want to open an account, you take a gas bill. There has to be a better way of proving it. I'm going to shop online at Christmas. I don't like the fact that I can't prove who I am. So I think we really do need to think about the identity issue and how we prove who we are. I do think with respect to the cards, I think the security aspects of it will be looked at again in the light of events this week, as it should be.
So it doesn't knock it on the head? It's not a nail in the coffin, is the question put for you?
I don't think it does knock it completely in the head, no.
You, sir?
I think most of the information that would probably be held in these cards is already available to a lot of private companies. I'd much rather have my personal details held by the government. I mean, I know there's a lot of issues of trust, but I would rather somebody who's accountable to me has access to that information than some businessman who, can do whatever he wants with it.
David Steele?
Well, I have to be very careful what I say on this subject, because the last time I spoke on this subject, on this very programme, my words were taken up by Tony Blair and used against my party in the Commons, because I said I thought they'd be rather useful, which is not the party line. I now think, in the light of this, I think the questioner is right to put the question. I seriously have changed my view. I think that this episode demonstrates the danger of allowing the government, until such time as they have publicly and transparently put in place systems that protect the information that they have, I think they would be wise to scrap it. If I can give you a little personal episode that happened to me this week, which illustrates the problem. I happened to have my wife's car in London this week. I didn't need to ask why, but I did. And it wasn't registered for the congestion charge. So I telephoned the congestion charge people and said, how can I pay this? And they said, what's the registration number? I gave them it. And they said, oh yes, it's a blue Citroen Berlingo. I said, yes, that's right. Gave them my credit card number, paid the charge. When I put the phone down, I thought, wait a minute, how did they know what the colour or the model of my wife's car is? The reason is, of course, it's held by the national database in Swansea. I never told them they could give it to Ken Livingstone, but they had done. And I think this is a trivial illustration of a serious problem that in the computer age, we don't know who all is having the information. It doesn't matter about the colour of the car or the model. It does matter when it's your bank account or your medical records. It's a serious matter, and that's why I think we should say no to the credit card system until they've sorted all that out.
Regarding Labour, how are we supposed to trust the government now? This is clear incompetence with Alistair Darling, with the whole department. How are we supposed to trust Labour? When it came to terrorism, Labour messed up, and now this as well, and you want to get ID cards as well. It's clearly wrong.
Annabel Goldie?
Yes, well, I'm trying to look for a little cheer in the midst of this awful, gloomy mess, because gloomy mess it is, because what I think the shambles that HRMC has disclosed is there is systemic failure at the heart of government. And that, to me, suggests, I mean, you know, HRMC's got form. Let's be quite clear about this. I mean, this is an organisation that apparently has over 2,000 security breaches a year. 41 laptops were stolen in the last 12 months. And just earlier this month, you know, the national insurance details of 15,000 people went into the Four Winds. So what I think it illustrates is that it's actually quite impossible for government to know what's going on, and the prospect of government having our personal details on a database which they cannot control. And that's what this unfortunate incident demonstrates, is to me completely unacceptable. And the silver lining that I talk about is, I think this shambles has hauled ID cards in the water for good.
David Aaronovitch, do you agree with that?
It's possible. I mean, you've got to say it's possible. I support ID cards. I support them because, I mean, it's one of these things that the electorate has what they call cognitive polyphasia about. In other words, it can think two things, different things at the same time. It wants, for instance, to know how many people are in the country, but it doesn't want to establish, some people don't want to establish the only known method of trying to register how many of us there are in the country and so on. The issue becomes, therefore, can you safeguard that information exactly the way that the chat there says? Can you try and do it? Now, the big problem with this is this now sends the message to the majority of the electorate who actually, contrary to what Nicola Sturgeon said, actually up until now have supported ID cards, maybe not on a terribly well-informed basis, but they have. But it sends out the message, you might be at some kind of risk as a consequence of this. And so for a supporter of ID cards like me, and I think I take a similar position to the position David did, I now think, I mean, what this shows is that a junior person could do something quite so breathtakingly stupid with the knowledge of his seniors, says that there's a culture about information within that department, which is not a terrible department, which is not acceptable. And unless you can prove that it's changed, then people are not going to accept ID cards.
Yeah. But it's not just within that department, David, because there've actually been 16 admitted computer security lapses in the last 6 years in different government departments. That's the worrying thing.
The one over there on the right.
What worries me is not necessarily for myself as an adult, because if someone fraudulently takes my identity, then I can deal with that. But where the child benefit issue is concerned, my children can't. And 10, 15 years down the line, when someone's walking about with their national insurance number, my maiden name, I can't do anything to protect them at the moment for that. My government should have done that for me. That's what they're there to do.
What do you say to that, Wendy?
I mean, I've got 2 young kids too, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that, you know, when I heard about this on the news on Tuesday, I thought, gosh, this is grim. People worry about identity theft for their children. I suppose also, if I'm also honest about it, I don't want to go to a post office and try and get there for, 1 o'clock on a Saturday before it closes. I want my child benefit to be paid to me automatically, but I also want the government to protect it. And I do think, as David says, we need to start having not just the spot checks that were announced, but criminal penalties, because that's the way you change behaviour in an organisation.
I don't worry about my child's identity and fraud identity for my child until this week.
Yeah, exactly.
Because when I filled that form in, when I gave birth to my son and my daughter, and I handed it into the local office, I assumed that that was in the strictest confidence. And yet again, Labour's proved that it's not in the strictest confidence. It's open market. It's there for anyone to take.
The man in the yellow T-shirt there, you sir.
I work for HM Revenue and Customs.
Ah.
I think contrary to popular public opinion, most HMRC and indeed civil service people that work within the civil service work extremely hard and deliver a very good service. What I think the public need to understand is that over the last few years, Gordon Brown and the Treasury have taken steps to vastly change the way that the civil service is run. There's been massive cutbacks. We're in the middle of 25,000 job cuts and cutbacks on the budgets. So what you have is an organisation that's working with harder than ever to deliver more with less. And when you get that sort of environment, you've got staff who are under pressure, who are unhappy because there's virtually no promotion and they're being offered wages that are below the rate of inflation, wage rises. And if you've got that sort of culture, it's no wonder that you get mistakes like this.
What's been the reaction in the place where you work to this crisis? What have people been saying?
People that work for the civil service are human beings. The reaction is just the same as just the same as everyone here. We're not machines. We're not just because we work for the government machines. We're all human beings, and obviously there's a mistake been made. But there are procedures and there are best practices in place, and these are followed in the vast majority of times.
I think that's a really fair point. I think it's deeply unfair to blame an individual member of staff for this, particularly a junior member of staff. This is, as Annabel said, a systemic failure, a failure of procedures. What I find most breathtaking about this is not that this junior official did it, it's that he was able to do it. It's that he was able to sit in front of a computer and download the entire contents of the Child Benefit Register onto a disk. That wasn't his fault, that was the fault of a systemic procedural breakdown, and that's what must be addressed.
Okay. Woman in spectacles there. Yes.
I just think that the one positive thing to take from this is the fact that we'll now realise with ID cards that there isn't going to be competence surrounding it. What happened when first they went with ID cards, they did terrorist scaremongering among the public, and any support that they did get by way of that, I think, was to do with that scaremongering, whereas now people are actually waking up to the reality that you shouldn't be having that much personal information being held by anyone.
Okay. And you, sir, in the front here.
I actually still in theory agree with ID cards, but certainly what's happened this week has shaken my confidence. If you'd asked me last week, I'd have been 100% in favour of them for the reasons that people have stated in the past. But certainly like 25 million people's private lives have gone somewhere and no one knows where. It's a scary thing. The theory behind them is fine, but certainly I'll be rethinking exactly what I think what's going to happen in the future with all our personal information on an ID card, who's looking after it, and is our data safe?
Let's broaden this question out a bit. Stephen Martin, I've got a question for us.
Yes, another day, another fiasco. Is any government department now fit for purpose?
Another day, another fiasco. Well, I suppose you were thinking of what? Northern Rock?
Well, Northern Rock, DEFRA, anything. What's going on just now? The Treasury, everything.
Everything. Nicola Sturgeon, everything.
Well, I think the more pertinent question is the government, the Gordon Brown government, fit for purpose, not just any government department. I think looking at the government, the wheels really have started to come off the wagon. I understand there's an opinion poll out tonight that show Labour even further behind, and I think people's confidence...
9 percentage points behind.
Thank you for giving that factual background, but I think people's confidence in the government has been seriously dented, and it started with the election that wasn't. And I think the real fundamental problem Gordon Brown has got now is that he's built this reputation for competence. It's all that he really has, because nobody really knows what he's about, what his vision is, what he's trying to achieve for the country. And once the reputation for competence starts to go, and it has started to go, what you're finding is that there's really nothing left. And I think people have started to lose confidence, and lose confidence very badly.
I mean, it's not been a great week for the government. That, I think, is an honest admission of this week. I think there are two different issues. I mean, there has been an appalling breach on on child benefit. I think the Northern Rock situation is very different. I mean, in Northern Rock, the government has intervened to preserve the stability of the banking system, and it has done so. And that, I think, is the right thing to do. The challenge now is to make sure that the savers in Northern Rock get protected and the stability of the banking system is preserved. And I think they are decisions which are the right decisions for the government to make. Not easy decisions to make, but it was a decision to protect the banking system that was supported by all parties at the time.
Nicola Sturgeon was attacking your government and Gordon Brown, to whom you were a close supporter, on general competence, on everything he's done, really, since in the last few months, and supported by tonight's opinion poll showing you 9 points behind the Tories, which you haven't, I think, been since 1992.
I'm tempted to say in 1992 the polls were very volatile, and working for the Labour Party then we'd high hopes and they all turned to naught. But I think more seriously, the poll was taken in the last 24 hours. It was after it became apparent that the discs had been stolen, and I think, you know, I concede there was a huge amount of anger about that, and rightly so. I think the substantial issue where the Chancellor was called upon to act was, are we going to preserve the British banking system and stability around it? And there he acted with competence, and we haven't seen the run in the whole banking system, which was at risk had he not acted.
I see you're not coming to the defence of Gordon Brown ad hominem, so to speak, but on those two issues. The gentleman who asked the question, do you want to come back on it?
The point is that you've stored up Northern Rock to the tune of £39 billion of our money, basically made it privatised. The Scottish Executive, Scottish Government, has been given £24.4 billion to run Scotland for the next year. What's going on? Why are we getting such a short-changed? And you're storing up a private bank with £39 billion of our money. What's going on?
Well, I think I'm going back to the earlier observation. I mean, what is happening? And I think what is happening is that this government now is being driven by events. It's not actually governing and directing events. And that's a serious situation for it, because that's when I think confidence begins to ebb away. Now, if we look at what's been happening, yes, we've had DEFRA, we've had Home Office, we've had Treasury, but what we see is actually something that's perfectly logical. It's the effect, frankly, of 10 years of indifference to how systems work, to what people's responsibilities are, to how you ensure good and sensible government, to how you make sure decisions are practical and wise. And what we see is, because of, in my opinion, 10 years of neglect. I mean, earlier on we talked about HRMC, and I have a lot of sympathy with the gentleman in the audience who works for that organisation. But what the government did was, for example, to ignore advice given to it by numerous groupings, including the Public Services Union, about the difficulties that everybody could see in that organisation, and the government did nothing. With Northern Rock, I have to disagree with Wendy Alexander. In fact, although some action was taken, it was too late, because when advice was given by the Bank of England on a Sunday, I believe, look, we need to do something to reassure depositors, nothing happened till Monday night, by which time £3 billion had whistled out Northern Rock. And I think it's this, Wendy, that is beginning to unnerve people. They feel the government is not actually in charge any longer.
Beginning to unnerve you?
No, I don't think so. Suffice to say, I think it's a little bit rich coming from the Conservatives that they were talking today about a Black Wednesday. I mean, there was no doubling of interest rates that we saw under the Tories. I think the difficulty around Northern Rock is the money hasn't been given as taxpayers' money. It has been lent. There is every expectation that will come back. It's been secured against the best assets. And the reason for that is, had we not done it, we would have been saying to the workers in that organisation, the savers in that organisation, the people who had mortgages in that organisation, that they would pay the price for what was going on in the subprime market in the United States.
Can you explain the rather curious expression you used, there's every expectation that it will come back? What does that mean?
Well, the Treasury
the
Treasury has made clear that these are loans, and they've done it to preserve the stability of the banking system, and that they expect the money to come back because they have lent it against very secure assets in this country, properties that people have who borrow mortgages, savers who have invested in that organisation. And the reason they did it was to make sure that the savers in this bank, and indeed the workers, but also people who had mortgages with this bank, wouldn't suffer. That's about making sure that there's stability in the whole banking system, and that, I think, was the right decision, and the money is expected to be paid back.
I'd just like to know what it takes to get a ministerial resignation these days. You know, we have somebody sacked for swearing at somebody at an awards dinner, and then we have half the country's secure personal details being lost. Somebody gets sacked, and nobody gets sacked. Nobody takes responsibility for that.
Do you have somebody in mind?
Well, at least the junior minister who's in charge of the department. But it doesn't seem to be. The junior official has resigned. The head of the HMRC has resigned. What about a ministerial resignation?
David Steele?
David, a few minutes ago, the man up there was saying that civil servants are human beings. Well, so are politicians. And I must admit that when I first heard about the discs going missing, I felt very sorry for Alistair Darling. There are thousands of people employed in that department. Somebody makes a mistake. How was he to know that that mistake was going to be made? And I think you must draw a clear distinction between that sort of thing happening, which can happen. Annabel did happen as well under the Conservatives. You must draw a distinction between that and the Northern Rock situation, which is very much Alistair Darling's responsibility. Now, he has actually lent to Northern Rock the equivalent of £900 for every one of us in this room, for every taxpayer. £900 has gone to Northern Rock. The chief executive has gone. He's got a golden pension attached to it. And there's no guarantee. He's not given a guarantee, and nor could Wendy give a guarantee that we're never going to get that money back. That's the key thing.
I don't really care
and it should
what
have been
he
brought into
resigns
public
for.
ownership.
So
let's draw a distinction between something for which he is responsible and other things.
That's true, David. But it was still.
Can you not resign over something?
But it was still the right thing to do. I mean, this is kind of the problem. I haven't yet heard anywhere an alternative notion as to what Alistair Darling should have done over the Northern Rock situation. Should we have allowed a general banking collapse?
No.
Is that what everybody wants?
No.
No, I don't think you do, because actually it would have affected the banks you really are in. Most of you aren't with the Northern Rock. Suppose it had been the banks you were. Suppose there had been a general run on bank confidence.
The point that Annabel Goldie was making was that it was done so slowly that confidence eroded far more than it would otherwise have done, and therefore more money was needed.
Yes, I know, but she's essentially talking about a very few matter of hours.
Well, it was enough story to see it on the television. Everybody went rushing to Northern Rock to get the money out.
Well, maybe he is culpable about that. But what nobody suggested is that there was somehow an alternative strategy, and that this 900 quid, which has been lent for each of us and so on, should not have been lent. Of course, it should have been done. It was the right thing to do. So let's not kind of get it out of proportion. And can I just say, incidentally, I will be more convinced about this kind of resignation strategy and so on that politicians are always supposed to do if other people were to resign a little bit more if things go wrong in their... If headmasters were to resign when things go wrong in their schools, or if BBC executives were to resign...
Oh, come on, the BBC never stopped resigning.
That's sacking. No, that's sacking. Oh, you mean...
Yes,
editors of Blue Peter fired, I think.
No, I was thinking of higher up, chairman and director generals over Hutton. Yeah?
OK, well, maybe more could resign.
I resign. Sorry. The guy, did you want to come back? No, let's go. Have we got a woman's hand up there? Oh, you come back, yes, the man who works for the thing, yeah.
Yeah, the gentleman over there just alluded to some resignations, and we've been talking quite a lot now about resignations. I think people are missing quite a massive resignation that hasn't taken place recently. Paul Gray has resigned, which is perhaps honourable, and the government's accepted that. Sir Ian Blair is still in charge of the police force, and his organisation shot and killed an innocent man, and I think that's slightly more important than losing some taxpayer details.
He got a vote of confidence today, though, from the police authority.
Well, are we saying that a man's life is less important than some taxpayer details?
Yeah, OK. Just before we leave... Just before we leave Gordon Brown, and you were saying things are falling apart, what do you make of this report tonight about the former Chief of the Defence Staff saying that Gordon Brown treats the armed services with contempt and lack of interest?
Well, if I were Gordon Brown as Prime Minister, I would feel thoroughly ashamed that someone of the experience of this gentleman, I think is Lord Boyce, is that right, who's made this comment. And I mean, I think everyone has concerns about what we are asking, what the government is asking of our armed service personnel, because it seems to me that we're stretching them to breaking point. Again, commentators over the piece, eminent military individuals, have been saying to Gordon Brown, we can't go on like this. Morale is poor. We're not looking after our service personnel's families and their children. There are in some cases appalling housing conditions. Now, all of that is happening, David. And where is the government in all of this? Again, to me, this is part of an absolute pattern of neglect and disregard for the essential services of this country.
Right. Admiral Boyce said that it was an insult to give Des Brown the job of being Defence Secretary and Secretary of State for Scotland, and said some might call it contempt that the Prime Minister and his government have for the armed forces. Wendy, Alexander.
Well, I mean, I don't agree with that. I think one of the great joys of the House of Lords is that it is a space where people can speak their mind, and that should remain the case. And it's perhaps not the case for all of us to second-guess them on everything. I mean, there are issues around army personnel, and the MOD recognise that. And I'm not sure it helps serving personnel if I turn it into political football by seeing an eminent Admiral or indeed Chief of the Staff, Defence Staff commenting on this is wrong. I think people have to be allowed to speak their mind in the House of Lords.
But we have to recognise that something's changed. Something really quite big has changed. It's changed partially as a result of Afghanistan and Iraq. It's changed partly because society has changed. There was this kind of attitude, essentially, that the kids that went into the army, quite largely often from poor backgrounds, etc., we didn't really care too much about the conditions there, because they were likely to be better than the conditions they came from, I think, partially. That has completely altered. The idea that we send people to be blown up in Helmand and so on is so kind of foreign, really, to our everyday experience that we now demand more for the conditions for the armed services than we ever did before. We demand more in terms of their medical care. We demand more, rightly, in terms of their housing, in terms of their family conditions. And all the political parties are going to have to get their heads around the fact that there is now no more Cold War dividend. We need to increase the amount we spend on the armed services if they're going to continue to do that job for us.
There are two separate issues here. The question of Mr Brown having to couple being Defence Secretary with Secretary of State for Scotland is a hangover from Tony Blair's attempt to abolish the office and then discovered he couldn't. And if you remember, previously the Minister of Transport and the Secretary of State for Scotland were together. It's a very unhappy situation. What should happen is that there should be a Minister for Constitutional Affairs with perhaps a junior minister for each country underneath him. The post should disappear, and Des Brown shouldn't be expected to do both. But on the bigger issue, here we have morale in the armed forces at low levels. As Annabel said, that the housing is under criticism. The lack of helicopters is under criticism, the lack of body armour, the lack of armoured vehicles. Why, at the same time, are we still talking about replacing Trident, which is a Cold War weapon, which is long out of date? We should abandon that.
I think this government, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, have treated the armed forces very, very shabbily. I'm not sure the merging of the two positions is their biggest offence against the armed forces. After all, Secretary of State for Scotland is not particularly an onerous job. I'm far more concerned with the fact that they were sent to an illegal war in Iraq without the right equipment, and the Scottish regiments were merged while they were there. I think that's the real offence.
Well, David Steele mentioned the future of Trident. Let's just turn to his party. Jenny Longmuir, you have a question about the latest state of play, yes.
Has the public spat between Chris Huhne and Nick Clegg reinforced the public impression of the Liberal Democrats as a party of backstabbers?
A party of backstabbers, David Steele. I'm not... no, I won't come to you first. Come to Annabel Goldie. Annabel.
What could I possibly say? I mean, I just...
say no.
I just thought it was... I mean, I would say, in deference to my female colleagues here, that when I saw the spat, and I did see it on television, I thought, you know, it's just two men, egos up, they need to get the jackets off, they can't sort it out, and they just engaged in this pretty unseemly spectacle. I think politics can be better than that, and I don't think it was a great credit to the party, I must be honest, David.
David Steele, you're a supporter of Huhne, aren't you?
Yeah, but...
Enthusiastically endorse him, a man of ability and experience, you said.
OK, hang on a minute.
Yeah, no, just wondering whether you still subscribe.
I do, but I didn't see the programme. But I have heard them at a public occasion, and I've also heard them privately at a parliamentary party meeting. And the fact is that whichever is elected is going to provide very good leadership for the party. I'm convinced of that.
You're the one who stabs firmest.
No, they haven't stabbed. There was again, we come back to the same question over the disc. There was some junior researcher who put that heading on an internal briefing.
Calamity Clegg.
Which was very stupid.
Have you read it?
No, I haven't seen
No,
it.
it's quite enjoyable.
And I'm not part. I'm not part of anybody's campaign, but I do support Chris Huhne, among other reasons. Well, I happen to have known him for 25 years, and he worked with me very hard last year on the Steel Commission report about self-financing for the Scottish Parliament, which is an issue we haven't discussed yet tonight, but I think it's an important issue. So I've known him a long time, and I support him. But among other reasons I support him is that he is against replacing the Trident missile system, and I think that's a very important issue.
Okay. David Aaronovitch.
I thought it was actually a glorious moment for the Liberal Democrats. I mean, firstly, it's the only thing that they've done which has made anybody notice that there's an election going on at all. And actually, that's quite an important thing for a political party. The second thing is that they were going hammer and tongs actually about policy. Because what Huhne was saying to Clegg was, this is what you've been saying about policy. And Clegg was saying back to Huhne, actually, I'm not going to go down that road now, although he had actually previously been going there. That's exactly what debate should be like. When you have the Australian election, one of the things that's wonderful is that they don't have this kind of culture of everybody's making a gaffe if they speak their mind. You're allowed to go out and you're allowed to say it, and you're allowed to say, no, I think you're telling a great big lie there, actually. I think you're trying to obfuscate it, etc. Here we have to kind of dress it up. You're not allowed to have proper arguments. You, the public, or sorry, us in the audience, we're allowed to say what we like, but the politicians have to be oh so careful. I want them to be able to say the same things as that people in the audience can say in the same language.
Good, okay.
Does it actually really matter who becomes Liberal leader? Are the Liberals not just an irrelevance in British politics anyway? They can say what they like, or if we win power, we'll ban Trident or we'll get rid of top-up fees. They're never going to have to follow through on it.
Wendy Alexander?
Well, I couldn't possibly agree, and we were coalition partners with the Liberals in Scotland for 8 years. I mean, in one sense, David is right that, policy matters, and there is a substantial issue about how the health service should be funded. But I also agree with Annabel, it doesn't need to get personal. I mean, politicians are no better or worse than anybody else. The truth is, we don't always live up to our best instincts, but we should be encouraged to live up to our best instincts and not get personal. And this stuff is what we would say in Glasgow, just tomorrow's chip paper. It's a policy issue that matters, and you don't need to get personal.
Is that what your press officer at this awards ceremony, who I gather was trying to promote you over the last couple of months, and we used the C word about...
the C word?
We're not allowed to say it on even
it wasn't
the
Conservative.
Conservative. Shorter. About Nicola Sturgeon's leader, about the First Minister, and then apparently also used the F word, which again we're not allowed, I won't use probably, about hating the middle classes. Is he speaking for you?
No. And
Wendy likes the middle class.
I mean, it was a member of my staff who behaved unacceptably one evening, and he paid with his job, which is a high price. But I do think people have high standards, and you have to live them.
That's right.
And he no longer works for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
If it was in Australia, the guy would have been promoted.
Yes. Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, I think to follow up on Wendy there, I mean, the individual in question behaved absolutely appallingly, but he did do the right thing. He resigned, and in fairness to Wendy, she quickly accepted his resignation. But back to the Liberal Democrats, it's much, much more fun.
How about that?
I was about to be fair to the Liberal Democrats, because I think, to be fair, emotions always run really high during leadership elections in any party, and I think we have to make some allowances for that. If I can now start being less fair, the Liberals haven't really covered themselves in glory in the past couple of years. I think the treatment of Charlie Kennedy, quickly followed by the treatment of Ming Campbell, has turned people off. Having said that, David, if I can turn to the David on my left now, I think he's got a point. I saw it on Sunday as well, and after the revelation, the quite spectacular revelation about Calamity Clegg, what then followed was actually quite an interesting debate about genuine policy differences, and that's all too rare in politics. So perhaps there is an upside. But I think if I want to agree most with anyone, it's the gentleman in the audience who asked the question, does anybody care? And I suppose I have to conclude that nobody in Scotland is sitting on the edge of their seats, perhaps with the exception of David, wondering whether it will be Hoon or Clegg who becomes the next leader of the Liberal Democrats.
OK. One more point from you, Sab, then.
At least they're having a debate. Where was the challenge to Gordon Brown?
Anybody could have challenged Gordon Brown under the rules, couldn't they? The Foreign Secretary could have challenged him. The woman there in red, yes.
I agree that policy is important and that high standards should be maintained in public life. However, I do find it refreshing for a change that people can have disagreements being in the same party, and we're not subjected to the same spin that we were in the relationship between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown.
OK. Let's go on. We've got to go on. Yeah, very briefly.
I just make the point that we've been going up in the polls since the leadership election started, which shows that people are actually interested in who becomes the next leader.
Well, it means they've heard of you.
You're at 14% on the one published tonight.
Well, 13 to 14.
Well, it's better than 11.
Just announcement about where we are next. It's York next week, and the week after that we're in Cambridge. And if you like to come and listen to the recordings in either York or Cambridge, 0871 626 9988 is the number to call, or you can go to our website. Now, while I'm on about the website, this is the moment in the year when you can apply if you want your school to take part in the school's question time competition. All the details are on our website, or you can be led to them. The winners, remember, of this get to produce their own edition of Question Time. School kids doing their own edition of Question Time, choosing the panel, choosing the questions, and telling me what to do. And if you note the email address, you can get details from tomorrow, and your schools have to apply by January the 18th, but it's not a moment too soon to start working out how you'll do that. And I do recommend it. It's terrific fun and very, very good for the political interests of the school and all of that, public information. So go to the website for that. A question now from Alistair Bailey, please. Alistair Bailey.
How can you justify Scottish MPs voting on English issues?
How can you justify, this was raised, of course, by Sir Malcolm Rifkind for the Tories just recently, that there should be a special English committee that dealt with English issues. Wendy Alexander, how do you justify Scottish MPs voting on English issues?
I think this is the famous West Lothian question. Well, I'm tempted to say to a Scottish audience, it was, of course, the case that English MPs voted on Scottish issues for most of the last 100 years and indeed visited the poll tax upon us, and that was one of the key drivers of the Scottish Parliament. But
well, presumably that will make you understand the argument better,
yes,
and
it
therefore
does.
you'll accept it.
Let me do the question justice. I don't take the position of being an unthinking unionist in that sense. I think there are tensions between Scotland and England. I think there are issues to be resolved. My own view is that there is more interest in the financial relationship than there is on the question of votes. But I think if people want to look at this issue, then they should have the right to do so. As I say, I think the financial one is the one that causes more heat out there than the issue of votes. And I think we do have to be very careful about whether we're going to create two different classes of MPs, because we gave people in England the chance in the North East to vote for a regional assembly. They said no, and I think the truth is that most people in England think of Westminster as both a parliament for England and a parliament for Britain. And we've got to think about how we work our way through that.
When you talk about the financial, you say, are you tapping into a feeling that there's increasing resentment in England about the financial structure of the Union?
I think there's both greater resentment in England, but I also think in Scotland there's a desire in Scotland to walk taller rather than walk out. And part of walking taller is, I think, we should take more financial responsibility for our own affairs in Scotland. So I think the finance issue should be looked at. And I think what we want to do is not let the housekeeping bills get in the way of breaking the marriage, but the housekeeping bills deserve to be looked at again.
Annabel Goldie.
Well, I actually totally disagree with something that Wendy has said, because unlike Nicola, who is very clear about her objective politically of independence for Scotland, which is not an objective I share, and it's not one which Wendy Alexander shares, and it's not one which David Steele's party shares, I have to say, Wendy, I mean, I think down south in England, Yes, you're right, the financial issue has loomed large, but if I may say so, it's loomed large because, frankly, I think there's been totally irresponsible peddling of misinformation by certain commentators and tabloid elements of the press. Now, for example, David, in England, people genuinely think that Scotland is up here in the land of milk and honey getting more than anybody else in the rest of the UK is getting. Absolutely not true. In terms of public expenditure, Northern Ireland gets most, followed by London, followed by Scotland. And I don't hear these commentators ranting and raving about Northern Ireland and London, so why are they ranting and raving about Scotland? So I think that the second myth is under the Barnett formula, David. People down south, again, genuinely believe that since devolution, something miraculous has happened financially to Scotland. We've always had money under the Barnett formula in recent times, even before devolution. That's how money is allocated throughout the United Kingdom. There's nothing mysterious about it. There's nothing essentially wrong about it. That's what happens. But again, ill-informed commentators, whether deliberately or mischievously, imply south of the border that somehow or other post-devolution, we've been getting some quite undue and unfair share of the
Sorry,
cake.
but you're not leaving aside London, you're not suggesting that per head more money goes to England than to Scotland out of the revenue provided by or decided on by Westminster, are you?
What I said was...
No, I'm asking you whether you're saying that.
No, what I'm saying is that per head of population in terms of public spend, the commentators down south in some quarters imply that Scotland gets more than anywhere else. We don't.
David Aaronovitch.
I don't really quite understand your argument, Annabel. The reason why this issue is raised in the way it is because neither Northern Ireland or London go round with a local government that says it's Northern Ireland's oil. That's why it happens in this way. The whole reason why resentment is being stoked up by the right-wing tabloids in England at the moment is it's the Conservative reflection of what the SNP are doing up here in Scotland, and that begins to feed down. There is a synergy here. There's a synergy between some sections of the right-wing press in England. I don't mean that they're conspiring. I mean that there's a kind of pincer movement here, effectively, and the demand for Scottish independence up here in Scotland, and those two things are feeding each other. Most people down south, in that kind of down south, actually don't have a very developed idea about who's earning what in Scotland. I mean, I have much, much more to say about the question about the independence of Scotland, which I would enormously regret as a British person and so on. But I have to say it's fed by that kind of thing. And I think we are genuinely sleepwalking into a separation which people will regret. And I think, you know, the words of the Joni Mitchell song come back to mind, don't they? You don't know what you've got until it's gone.
Yes, but David, I mean, my point was, and I didn't finish dealing with Wendy's earlier admission. The point I'm making, David, is that there are myths being peddled down south which are quite unacceptable, and it's absolutely essential that the facts are put on the record. And that's the only point I'm making.
Okay.
Where I disagree with Wendy is she says she thinks it's this financial element which is creating the tension with Westminster and creating the tension for certain English constituents and their MPs. I disagree. I think what is really sticking in the gullet is that English MPs and their constituents now see in three parts of the United Kingdom domestic legislators making their decisions on domestic issues, and not only can they not do that, but Scottish MPs are going down and voting on these issues when they've not an ounce of electoral responsibility to anyone for that. That's not fair, Wendy, and that's causing tension.
David Steele.
Hang on, just let me remind you what happened before we had a Scottish Parliament. Every Scottish bill, I sat through the House of Commons voting on Scottish bills, and the majority was an English and Welsh and Northern Irish majority. We were hopelessly outnumbered. The decisions on legislation for Scotland were made by the House of Commons as a whole, and that is different from a small number of Scottish MPs having a marginal say over English legislation. There's nothing we can do about the fact that England happens to be bigger than Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland put together.
But this gentleman asked about the West Lothian question,
he asked
David,
about it, and
post-devolution it's there and it's got to be answered.
I know, but my answer is, yes, let's have an English Grand Committee, but not a separate institution. Have it to deal with the details of legislation for England as we used to have in the Scottish Grand Committee. Well, that's how we did it.
But when you have a Scottish Scottish MP as Prime Minister, you would then end up with a position where he would be putting forward his major planks of legislation affecting England, insofar as they affect England, and wouldn't be able to vote on them.
No, that's not the case. The detailed,
how would he vote
the detailed scrutiny of legislation should be done in an English
and voted on, presumably.
And voted on an English committee.
Well, then he wouldn't have control.
But then you still have the report stage of bills with the whole Parliament. That's what used to happen with Scottish bills before, and that's how it could happen again.
But Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon.
Can I begin? I'll address the question directly, but can I begin by welcoming Wendy Alexander's conversion to financial independence and Annabel Goldie's staunch defence against the argument that somehow Scotland is subsidised? Neither of them argued those cases in the recent Scottish election, which just shows how much progress we've made since then. But Annabel,
the Liberal
let
Democrats
me finish.
did, remember?
Well, we've dealt with the Liberal Democrats tonight, but let me agree with Annabel Goldie, because we have to shatter some of the myth that we're getting from some of the media, and I stress the media because I don't think this is a view held by most people in England. Not only is public spending per head higher in London than it is in Scotland, we contribute more taxes per head of population than any part of the UK outside of London. You know, and far from Scotland being feather-bedded, we've just had a budget settlement from London that is much tighter, much worse than the one south of the border. That is the reality, and it's about time we started to reflect that reality. But to answer the question,
sorry,
David,
just on this, you believe you provide more tax?
I don't believe it. I know it to be a fact,
well,
David.
It depends which figures you go for.
Oxford University Economics Department.
You're counting North Sea oil as being
forgive me, but I do think we have to count North Sea oil as being Scottish because it is Scottish. But can I answer the question? I don't think we can justify Scottish MPs voting on English-only matters. That's why SNP MPs don't vote on English-only matters unless it does affect the Barnett formula or affect Scotland directly. But it is difficult to find a UK solution to the West Lothian question. The best solution is the solution of independence for England and independence for Scotland, a new relationship of equals. That's the best solution.
All right, let's go from there. You say that. Yes, sir. Far away, that's you. No, the man with the spectacles, yes, you.
Yeah, the best way to do this is actually to make sure that we complete the devolution process.
Absolutely.
What's wrong with devolution for England?
Okay, and you, sir?
David's talking about the right-wing press causing the differences between Scotland and England. What about the left-wing BBC with online have your say? Every debate that comes up in that is anti-Scottish.
Every debate that comes up
Every other debate from have your say on the BBC website, moderated by English BBC staff, is anti-Scottish.
Anti-Scotland. Yeah. Oh, right. Who else? You, sir, in red.
Can we tackle the question of the resentment that David Aaronovitch talks about? I don't believe him. I don't believe the resentment comes from some creeping fear of independence, partly because we'll get to vote against it if we don't want it.
Exactly.
The Barnett formula has existed since before devolution. The financial settlement has existed since before devolution. But what you're seeing now is a Scottish Government enacting popular policies that we didn't get from Westminster, and people down south are looking at them and saying, we want a bit of that. They're getting something we haven't got, and they're jealous. That's what it's
They obviously were laying on good hospitality before this programme, because what you just... I heard that Alex Salmond had said exactly this thing last week, which was that Gordon Brown was unpopular because he wasn't doing the things in England that Alex Salmond was doing in Scotland, like tuition fees, like free... like all these other subsidies which you're giving to the Scottish middle class and claiming to be left-wing when actually they don't advantage the Scottish poor. They don't, when they don't advantage the Scottish poor at all. I have to tell you, there isn't a big appetite in England for those things. I don't know why you imagine that there is. They could have voted for a government like that with those sorts of policies, and they didn't.
David, you're a man who believes there's an appetite in England for ID cards, so,
well,
forgive me if I don't go along with
but
you, but the policies that we're talking about were put in place by the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats and coalition. The SNP has hardly been in power, and they are in a minority, so actually their position to enact legislation is very limited. This is since devolution in '99, not since the recent election.
The point your neighbour made is the best one. The fact is that if we stopped taking a block grant from the Westminster Parliament and had the fundraising capacity to raise the money in Scotland that we spend in Scotland, this would take away a lot of the arguments that Annabel rightly was talking about.
Okay, and you'd go for that?
Yeah.
All right, let's go on. We've got only we've got 8 minutes, 5, 6, 7 minutes left. We take another question. From Chiara Macari, please.
In light of the comments from the Director of Public Prosecutions and Lord Goldsmith, can Gordon Brown maintain his stance on extending the 28 days detention period for terrorist suspects?
Yes, this was the news that came out before a committee from Lord Goldsmith, that he would have resigned over 90 days, and the Director of Public Prosecution saying that he was satisfied with the position as it stands at the moment. David Aaronovitch.
One of the audience members earlier talked about effectively being scared by the spectre of terrorism, as if there were no such thing. There is such a thing, and there is a significant threat. The big question, which is everybody kind of asks themselves in a way, is how can we come to any kind of sensible public conclusion about what powers the police need under these circumstances? And I have to say the debate is incredibly unsatisfactory. It's unsatisfactory from the point of view of those who claim to defend liberty, who by comparing like with unlike, with what happens abroad, for instance, suggests that somehow we have the most draconian laws in Europe, which we don't. But it's also unhelpful from the point of view of the government, in which we have had a series of claims made, and I think this was more true before Gordon Brown came to office, about what the police needed without a proper public discussion about what the context of those were. Now, it seems clear that some of those people who've been detained have been knocking up close to the 28-day limit. Alex Carlile, Lord Carlile, former Liberal Democrat peer, who looks at these issues for the government but who's independent, has noted that some of these cases come close to the 28 days and so on. So we have to decide, essentially by a proper debate, whether or not we think that some extension beyond that is a good idea.
How would you be influenced in that by Sir Ken MacDonald, the Director of Public Prosecution, saying we're satisfied with the position as it stands?
Well, the DPP may well be. The DPP may well not have been under pressure under those circumstances in order to bring charges and so on. It may not be felt as a big problem at the DPP level. It's likely to be at the police level and the security service level where this is experienced as the biggest problem.
Nicola Sturgeon, hold on, I'll come to you. Nicola Sturgeon.
I think, in fairness to Gordon Brown, at least he said, unlike Tony Blair, that he wanted to try and build a consensus on this issue. I think if he's serious about that, then he really has to listen very, very seriously to the Director of Public Prosecutions, to Lord Goldsmith. I'm not persuaded by the arguments for extending the detention time limit. It's not because I don't think terrorism is a very real threat, because I do. We've learned that in Glasgow firsthand over the past few months. It's just because I believe, on balance, that we don't fight terrorism effectively by eroding civil liberties. If you take the incident at Glasgow Airport, having a longer detention time limit would not have made any difference to that at all. How we fight terrorism is through good intelligence, good policing, and good community relations. And I think that's what we've got to focus on, not in divisive debates that I think are more about posturing than they are about really strengthening the fight against terrorism.
The question wants to come back in. Chiara Macari.
I just think it's really telling that you say that there has been talk that some have almost come up to the 28 days. Not one person has reached the 28-day limit, and already people are talking about extending it.
Well, but that time would be too late, wouldn't it?
No, but no one has reached the 28 days.
International terrorism is a threat to all democracies. Absolutely. And yet our 28-day capacity to hold people without charge is the longest of any of the democracies. So I find it totally unacceptable that we should be extending beyond that. And if we start to erode our civil liberties, we are giving in to the terrorists.
But David, that's not true. I said it's comparing like with unlike. The system that a lot of the countries have abroad is that they have a preliminary holding charge. On the preliminary holding charge, you can hold somebody for up to a year. People will have noticed on the Meredith Kercher case, for instance, that the Italian police had the capacity on a preliminary charge to hold those people who might be suspected for a year pending trial. And so on. So it's not the same thing.
Not to hold it.
Yeah, but pending the trial, they can do that, and they can get a preliminary charge which enables them to do it.
In Italy, they can. Annabel Goldie?
Well, I think we've got to be careful about how we balance our very legitimate and genuine concern about the threat of terrorism and the reality of terrorism with what are very honourable constitutional bastions of personal liberty and freedom. Now, it seems to me that you don't go changing these fundamental rules, which are extremely important, unless there is an evidence-based case for doing it. And my concern is, going back to the point that Kira in the audience made, is I hear people like Sir Ken MacDonald saying, I'm not persuaded of the need for this change. Lord Goldsmith seems very, very uneasy about any potential change. And I think it is exceedingly unwise then to start dogmatically pursuing this, as the Prime Minister seems intent in doing, for no other reason than seem to be striking a position when we don't actually seem to have any evidence before us to justify this change.
Wendy Alexander, the Prime Minister striking a position rather than having evidence for this.
Well, I think what you said is let's try and seek consensus on what we should do, and I think it's right to have the discussion. I mean, I think what's changed, and it's a debate we need to have. I mean, in Scotland, the Law Society yesterday took a decision that, partly because of the existence of DNA evidence and how that was changing things, they wanted to look at some parts of the Scottish criminal law, the double jeopardy, that people can't go back to court twice. Now, in the same way, it seems to me, if you're up against international terrorism that relies on networks on the internet, which is what we were talking about earlier, on computers in all our lives, it is right to have a debate. Does the existence of those networks so fundamentally change things that we need slightly more time than 28 days?
As a contribution to that debate, what do you make of what Lord Goldsmith and the Director of Public Prosecutions have said?
Important views that they should be listened to. Let's have the debate and let's not take the decision until everybody has had the chance to have their say.
The woman in the front row here.
Yeah, I think terrorism is a very real threat in Britain today, obviously with the terror attacks in Glasgow and London. And it's just as Wendy Alexander was saying, with the networks of terrorists growing, sometimes you do need more than the 28 days. So I think we really have to enter into debate about it.
Right, okay, and the man there in the spectacles, bang in the middle, yes, you say.
Surely, if you give people more powers, then they're much more likely to find a use for them. And if we can all accept that we don't like the idea of people being locked up for 90 days and our civil liberties being abandoned, then surely without overwhelming evidence to show a need for this, then we should err on the side of caution and keep it as low as is possible.
I think this country is becoming a police state. Basically, nowadays, our own telephones being watched. The record for every and each phone is being kept for a year. The ID card is going to be imposed on us. So I just wonder, actually, what's next? 28 days for probably trafficking offence. They'll stop us as well.
Okay. And the last point from you, sir, in the striped shirt.
Internet has been shown not to work in the North Island before, and it's only helped to strengthen the cause of nationalists in Ireland. So I don't see why it's going to work now.
So you would not 28 days, and that's enough, yes?
Even the 28 days.
All right, and a last point from you, sir, the man there with his... Just be very brief, if you would.
What we currently have as a problem is the fact that these bills are remaining completely unchecked upon. There's no sunset clauses on them, which means they're permanent laws and they're staying in our bills, and people are not checking on them regularly, and that's what we need to do, is make sure that they're checked upon and make sure that we keep looking back at them.
Okay. Thank you very much. It ends question time for the week.